Welcome to this session today. We have a great webinar going on today. And as it states, the show must go on. Certainly with things going on and the increasing need to support remote workers, along with ongoing pressure to meet tight production deadlines, media and entertainment companies really are in a much more tough situation than what we were before. So today's discussion, we're going to focus on the tools and the technology for optimizing and accelerating workflows for distributed creative teams. First of all, I want to introduce our panel of experts we have here today. We've got Sam. He's VP Engineering and Technical Services at Melrose Inc. And, formerly a CTO of AntFarm. So you've got, like a 20-year history when it comes to this side of things. So Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Stan. So I work for Melrose Inc. We've been around since for about the last 18 years. We started primarily as a Mac reseller. We're currently the largest Mac reseller in the US. About 5 years ago, our owners decided to really start getting into the integration business, and we started doing a lot of installs for media and entertainment. I was brought on about 2.5 years ago and have been running the department since then. We've done a lot of work with Cumulo and a lot of work with clients over the past year to really get them to work with remote workflows. As we all know, it's been a challenging year. Hopefully we can help everybody else with that as well.
Now, you've got a lot of clients as well, like Toyota, Technicolor, Sony, Paramount. I mean, all over the place here, right? To, BuzzFeed, some of the newer ones, and JPL as well. So you've got a lot of experience in that. All right, so I'm going to turn it over here to Mike. He's Principal Systems Engineer at Cumulo. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Mike Bott. I've been in media and HPC storage for something like 25 years. I like building all kinds of things, as the text indicates there. I've been with Cumulo since late 2014. I've remained very focused on M&E since then. My largest customers here in Los Angeles are media. There's a really big animation shop you're all familiar with, 10 petabytes plus across several different tiers of storage, regularly hit with thousands of compute nodes for simulation or rendering. And we have a major broadcaster as well, 10 petabytes plus on both sides of the Atlantic, big broadcast repositories with all kinds of workflows glued to them. So a big variety of media workflows, and we've got a lot of experience with it.
Why don't you just give us a little bit about the timeline and where that fits then? Go ahead.
Yeah, let's talk about this. So Cumulo has been around a little while now. We've been in the market since 2015. We've added a lot of things since entering the market. So if you did take a look at Cumulo in 2015 or 2016, you should take a look again. The product is far different from then. You see all kinds of things that we added. We have continued to focus very hard on software quality and quality of support. And as you can see, in 2017, 2018, we started getting pretty focused on the public cloud. And so we have customers using our technology in the public cloud, on-prem, in hybrid cloud deployments, things called private clouds, which I still think is just folks' data centers. But Sam actually had a preview of this. Sam was one of the first customers of Cumulo. So I'd like to hand it to Sam and let him talk about that experience for a few.
Yeah. Actually, in 2014, we were approached by Cumulo. We were offered to be one of the first 10 clients. We worked with Cumulo in depth to really develop the solution prior to launch. There was a lot of very valuable experience from that. We got to drive forward the features that we needed at our company over at AntFarm. We were primarily doing motion graphics effects and theatrical trailer work at that time.
You've been obviously doing a lot of this stuff, and I think as well you like playing around in the gaming business. So, I mean, you're all over the place.
I do. Those are kind of my two addictions. It's storage and gaming. I actually worked with Sam when he was at AntFarm. I'm old enough at Cumulo, and I got to see a lot of the early flow between Cumulo and the customer. Definitely very embedded with the customer, weekly calls, listening to needs they had, and adjusting the software accordingly. So early on, kind of that rapid development led to a lot of benefits for media users, especially for the workflows that Ant Farm was engaged in.
Yeah, and I guess from the gaming point of view, that keeps your fingers in absolutely every piece of technology at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because gaming is what led me there in the first place. I mean, when I was very young, learning what I could about PCs just so I could get to playing games. When I was a bit older, learning about networking so I could get to playing games. You know, it did drive a lot of my technology knowledge for sure.
So yeah, at AntFarm, we got an opportunity to work with Cumulo prior to launch. We were able to develop with them the features that we needed in the solution and grow our needs and and work with Cumulo to build up the relationship to develop the technology that we needed out of the solution. We used them for a number of years subsequently, and then when I left AntFarm, I started working with Melrose as a reseller, and we've deployed it successfully at a number of locations.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those deployments then. I'm going to move here, and so basically, there's a lot going on this slide, but the essence is that we can be the centerpiece of these media workflows. You can glue many different workflows to us at the same time and not worry about one clobbering the other. This is a scale-out technology, so it's very good at broad access, both from interactive human users as well as very bandwidth-hungry machine users. So we're good at parallelism and aggregate performance like you see in these kinds of workflows: editorial, visual effects, 3D animation, mass transcode, broadcast repository, things like that. We are software defined, so we can run on lots of different platforms, from active archive to high speed, all NVMe, and that is what enabled our journey to the public cloud. The fact that we were software defined, that we didn't depend on any sort of proprietary hardware, allowed us to easily pick up our software and run it on instances in AWS or GCP. So we can use their building blocks to put together things that are analogous to the kinds of nodes that we ship for on-prem usage. And so we can easily and quickly, using AWS tools and our software, build a storage cluster that provides enterprise file services in the cloud. So I do want to talk about one. Sam mentioned that Melrose is an integrator. Yeah, and I want to talk about Motion specifically. That's a pretty nice story that we accomplished together.
Motion is a theatrical trailer company based out of Los Angeles. They have a couple different sites. They're multi-tenancy. They have multi-site locations, so they're syncing materials between two of their locations. And they're fully TPN compliant, so security is a big deal for them. We went in with Cumulo and replaced one of their Isilon clusters in one of their locations, worked with them to set up a syncing solution that, between two disparate storage solutions, proved quite challenging. And we had to make sure that ACLs, all the security privileges, all the shares, all the details that they need and that they developed against and that they present against were available in both sites and both locations 100% of the time. There were some networking challenges as well. It was a nice install, and it was a good time to work with Cumulo on that one.
Yeah, I remember working on that actually. I know that they have some TPN requirements. Can you talk about some of the things that we did on the systems side to ensure they were compliant?
Yeah, a lot of the requirements are really about making sure that people can't see data they're not allowed to, and that media doesn't get mixed across. So it's really about making sure that SMB3 stuff is in place, that full encrypted streams are in place, that no one can really access things they're not supposed to.
Yeah, I know we leveraged one of the features that Cumulo has. It's sort of a multi-tenancy feature in that it can filter lists of shares by network of the client. And so you can have several different subnets with several different groups working on the same Cumulo cluster, but all of them see completely different lists of shares. They don't even know of the existence of those other shares. So that's a very important, that compartmentalization is very important when you're dealing with pre-release intellectual property and you're dealing with it from multiple clients. So you can consider that a multi-tenant deployment. And I know that I actually worked with some of the engineers from Melrose on this one, on both the rack and stack and the network deployment, and it was fantastic working with them. Very knowledgeable about data center and network and storage. So let's get a little more detailed here. This is kind of a block diagram, and there's a lot more going on here, but it speaks a lot more definitely to the kinds of environments that we can deal with. So this is an example of like a hybrid cloud editorial setup. Okay, so we've got Cumulo in the cloud, we've got Cumulo on-prem. The workflow is bouncing back and forth between the two. We're taking advantage of a proxy workflow here to keep the infrastructure costs a little bit lower. And notice that we're using Teradici Virtual Desktop. There's some other options there, but most of the folks that we work with in AWS are using Teradici to get a very good experience for the artist who's sitting at home, but they're actually remote desktop connected to an AWS workstation. And that AWS workstation is connected over NFS or SMB to the Cumulo in the cloud. And like that, you've got a workflow shifted from on-prem to in the cloud using just simple cloud building blocks. So we have Cumulo has a major broadcaster in New York City that's doing on-demand editorial environments in AWS. So they've used the combined capabilities of AWS and Cumulo. It's all API driven. And so it's trivial for them to, with the system they've built, an internal customer can go request editorial capacity. So they say, I need it for this long, I need this data set, I'm gonna work in this codec, I need this many workstations, and so forth. And then their system goes and builds that environment in AWS and hands the keys over to the stakeholder. They go get all their editors plugged in, they do the work they've got to do, and when they're done, they can just tear it down. And so this we see as kind of one of the holy grail use cases of the public cloud, where you're using it to build temporary infrastructure that you don't want to own for months and years. You're just using it to accomplish one single project, and it kind of changes the way you're looking at OpEx versus CapEx. To talk about on-prem, and another way of saying that is private cloud. One good example is Game Show Network. Okay, they're doing large-scale editorial on a Cumulo. They have 50 plus Macs, all connected to a Cumulo cluster. And that replaced an XSAN several years ago with Cumulo, and they've been expanding the Cumulo to keep up with their growth. As Sony acquired a portion of them, and they saw a bunch of success with some of their original programming. Now, this stuff doesn't have to be editorial. I've just talked about editorial here, but you could easily see how a system like this, now let's say we replace the virtual edit suites with virtual artist workstations. And instead of finishing transcode, we had a stack of elastic compute. And so then we're set up for some visual effects or 3D animation with the artist connecting directly to those Teradici virtual desktops and then doing what they have to do to create a shot or a scene and then handing that to the render farm to run. And it can easily traverse both private and public cloud. They could be doing all of their work in a private cloud, but pushing the renders to the public cloud for access to elastic compute resources. Maybe their final renders are requiring a lot more compute nodes than they actually have available on-prem. And getting into the public cloud is an easy way to extend that and give yourself some more temporary resources without all the pain of renting nodes and bringing them into a data center and configuring them yourself. So we have several folks doing this. Span a lot of these media workflows from pure editorial all the way into animation and VFX. Now, Cumulo is pretty popular, but you don't have to take our word for it. Okay, all of these companies have bet their business on Cumulo. And there's quite a few of these that are joint Melrose Mac and Cumulo customers. So in the upper right there, we have Cosa VFX. They are a growing and mighty VFX house here in the LA area. They have a large Cumulo. They've been on Cumulo for several years now. They have a render farm and a bunch of artists pointed right at that thing. And their work is growing. And so whenever their work grows to a point that it outstrips the storage ability to handle it, all they have to do is add a node. That's one of the magic bits of scale out. Another one of the customers on there is Deluxe, and I actually want to hand it over to Sam to talk about that deployment a little bit.
Yeah, Deluxe is the install we did at Deluxe was for a smaller animation group. They replaced some other storage, replaced their networking, unified all that into a single namespace with Cumulo. They have about 40 different artists working off of the storage directly, doing renders directly. They primarily work in the Adobe Creative Suite. The install went pretty well. There were some challenges, though, that the Cumulo support team really helped us, especially on the networking side. We were getting some weird slowdowns, and the team was able to help us out with that one as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. One of the big advantages of Cumulo is the amount of visibility that we provide into your workload and into your capacity. So we're able to tell you all kinds of things about what's happening right now. And that includes stuff like per client visibility to throughput, and including what files those clients are touching right now, as well as per file visibility into throughput and IOPS. So you can see what the hottest file is on the system, and you can see who is touching it. And because all that data is easily available through a RESTful API, it's trivial to build something that pulls those API endpoints, and you can build yourself a time series database of what's happened per client per file in the system. And so that becomes very important when you and your growing business get asked to handle more and more projects in parallel. If you have that kind of time series data built up, it's easy for you to go analyze it and then tell the business how much more infrastructure you need. You will have excellent visibility into what the actual infrastructure cost was of any of your workloads. There's another logo on here that was a joint customer with us and Melrose, would be Bad Robot. They're actually serving multiple tenants with a single cluster. So it's the same kind of thing where we're doing SMB and NFS share filtering by, or share and export filtering by IP address, so that from one subnet, you can only see one subset of shares. You don't even know about the existence of the others. And that's important from a security perspective. You don't often you don't want that visibility outside of the people that are just working on that one thing. So one thing we like to say is, I started this slide out by saying, don't take our word for it. You can call any of the logos on this slide, call them up and ask them about Cumulo. We're fearless about that. We have a very high NPS. We've been over 80 for something like 5 quarters straight. And most recently we were over 90. And that's an excellent measure of how much our customers enjoy working with us and how much they recommend us to their acquaintances. So at this point, I want to open it up for some Q&A.
Yeah, let's see if we can get some questions going here on that. I've got a couple that have come in here. I guess either of you can answer this. How large can the system go, like the number of nodes and the amount of storage?
Yeah, great question. So the largest deployment is that we have in the world today is at our stated scaling limit. And this is really about testing, but it's a 100 node cluster. It's actually running on HPE gear. And it's north of 20 petabytes. The thing is massive. I mean, it's going to deliver probably north of 50 gigabytes a second. It's probably constrained by upstream networking. So it is extremely large, extremely high performance, and it's very robust. It can handle multiple failures. I believe that system is built to handle up to 4 node failures and still be read-write and serving data.
Wow, that's impressive if it can handle 4 node failures at this point in time. Well, when you've got that many petabytes, it must support 4K then.
Yeah, so in terms of capacity, it's pretty easy for us to support. 4K doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. For the broadest use case, we can handle 4K no problem. If it's DNX or ProRes 4K, even all the way up to Quad 4, we can handle it pretty well. If you come in and it's more like a film finishing workflow and the requirements are way up there, like if it's EXR frames and it's stereo and it's 60p and the EXRs have a bunch of layers in them, so they're 200 megabytes a piece, maybe not so much. There are a lot of storage systems that can handle that. But for the broad majority of use cases, we can handle 4K, either camera raw or ProRes or DNX, no problem.
Yeah, that sounds good. So one more question came in here. You talked to touch this a little bit on security, but it basically saying, how do you handle security?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few things that we do. I mean, the obvious one is you're domain joined for authentication purposes. That's one of our best practices, of course. Another is that we are encrypted both at rest and in flight. So reads done over SMB v3, as well as our replication protocol, are both completely encrypted as those packets are traversing the wire. And then the data on disk is completely encrypted as well. So if there's a physical compromise of your data center and someone gets a disk, they aren't going to be able to get any useful data off of that one disk. Finally, there is an audit stream that you can point at a syslog server or at Splunk or at Elasticsearch and Logstash and Kibana. And so that includes all administrative and file system events, including like source IP address and identity of the user. So you can also get a forensic record out of the cumulo of who touched what when, who changed what when, who deleted this stuff. And so when an upstream, say TPN comes in to audit, and they ask questions like, show me everybody who read this directory during this weekend, you can do that with Cumulo.
Well, that's good, having the total audit stream. That's very important aspect. A question here, I'm going to crank it over to Sam if you want to put your camera and mic back on. When you were dealing with some of the systems and things like that, did you end up with any file count limitations?
No, there is no file count limitations at this point. We had a number of issues with larger files in large directories, like a high amount of files in a single directory. But again, those were some of the issues that we discovered early on with Cumulo and worked with them to resolve those sorts of issues.
Yeah, and we have customers with absurd file counts. That's actually one of the things that distinguishes us in this space. We can handle billions of files in a single file system. These are file counts that are traditionally cause storage administrators to go, well, I probably have to deploy object. And the thing is, with Cumulo, you don't. You still get all of the POSIX file system semantics, even if you have billions of files. So I've got a customer based in the LA area that has clusters all over the United States, and in each of those clusters, they're way north of 1 billion files. One of them is even pushing 5 or 6 billion files. And we do have one customer with tens of billions of files in the same file system, and they actually all of the analytics continue to work. You can still do software upgrades. Drive failures we still reprotect away from failed drives very quickly. So none of the aspects of those multi-billion file counts hurt our functionality at all. You can safely deploy us in super high file count environments.
Well, clearly you're looking after on the object storage point of view.
Yes, exactly. That's actually one thing. I see a lot of folks saying, well, object is the only way I can solve this. And the reality is, the guys who built file systems long before Cumulo came along didn't have that engineering constraint. Okay, people weren't trying to put billions of files in a file system in the 90s or in the early 2000s. And so when file counts grew and object really got going, everybody assumed that was the only way to do it. And we're actually proving that is not the case. You can still get file semantics even with extremely large volumes and extremely large file counts.
Yeah, so I've got a question for you. What are Sam talked a little bit about what he was doing, but what do you see as the typical workflows that the customers are using?
Yeah, great question. So in the media space specifically, we see a lot of visual effects, a lot of 3D animation, a lot of editorial, and a fair amount of broadcast repository. So the idea of the thing that catches all the mezzanine files, there's a bunch of transcoding, there's a bunch of automation, moving files off of that, staging them on broadcast servers, and then the usual smattering of interactive use. And because of scale out, we're very good at dealing with lots of workflows being glued to one single large volume. And then finally, we have this class of storage called active archive. And so when folks think of an archive, they think of a head with a bunch of disks behind it that they can push things into. But when we think of active archive, we think of workloads that look like archive, but the amount of throughput would tip over one of those monolithic storage systems by running over the head. By being able to have lots and lots of nodes in an archival system, you can distribute that archive client workload across all the nodes in the cluster and still get really good throughput, even though it's an archive class product. So, we have deployed, I mentioned that large broadcaster with more than 10 petabytes. We're regularly seeing multiple gigabytes of throughput, even though it's a archival workflow. And in fact, I've even seen in that animation studio, I've even seen a little bit of rendering running against our active archive tier.
You talked about on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud, things like that. But where do you see this difference? And this question for you, Sam. CapEx, OpEx. Do people really get that whole picture yet?
Hey, anything with the cloud is a little bit more challenging to deal with because the model, the financial model in the industry really hasn't adopted a full OpEx model. But the reality, these days, things have changed drastically over the last year. As we all know, you have to work remote, and the reality is the cloud is the best way to enable that sort of workflow. Cumulo has definitely done a good job of presenting that in a cohesive strategy, and it's definitely something that we need to start looking forward towards more of in the future.
Yeah, if you look at the way Cumulo deployments in the cloud go, typically the other competition for these file workflows in the cloud don't provide the level of visibility, scalability, or performance that Cumulo does. Even the native offerings. Cumulo is bringing the software intelligence that they've developed against these on-prem workflows into the cloud and just leveraging the same building blocks. So, it's most of the systems are hybrid. So there's an SSD tier as a cache, and then there's a spinning disk tier as the storage layer. And the same paradigms are intact when we go into AWS. We can use GP2 SSD as our cache layer, and we can use either ST1 or SC1 as the storage layer. And interestingly, all of our caching intelligence, all of that caching intelligence that we developed against on-prem workflows translates nicely to the cloud and even does a good job of absorbing some of those performance downsides of the slower block storage technologies like SC1. So customers have found that they can actually move these workloads into the cloud and make some budget-conscious choices in their storage deployment and still serve a very parallel workload of multiple editors or artists.
So you talked a little bit about working with AWS and with Google Cloud as well. Are people using both systems at the same time, or for that matter, even can you go from one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket?
So we can actually build. We can build in MultiCloud. We can have a cluster in AWS that's replicating to a cluster in GCP. But when you do multi-cloud things, you have to be very cognizant of egress charges. And so replicating a steady state workload with a high change rate is signing you up for a lot of egress charges. One of the things we see is folks using the cloud for these burst workloads, like I say, the temporary editorial workload or burst rendering. So one of the things customers talk to us about is a way to extend their render farm at will into either of those two cloud technologies, into either AWS or GCP. And then them being able to provide an internal service that optimizes based on the needs. So maybe it's a render that needs a fast turnaround. Maybe it's a render that needs to be cheap. Maybe it's a render that needs to be extremely high quality, so it requires lots of compute. And so those might drive different choices of which cloud provider to use. I think that's more the way we're going to see multi-cloud consumed. I feel like we've experimented with cloud to cloud, and egress frequently turns into a problem.
You're right on that. There are still so many people I run into that that haven't figured out what they're being hit with all these charges. It's certainly been a rough go. We've got another question that had just come in here on let's just see, back-end networking speeds, 20, 10, 25, or 100 gig Ethernet options.
Absolutely. So our nodes on-prem span all the way from 10 gig, we have 25 gig, we have 40 gig, and we have 100 gig nodes. Our fastest node, which is all NVMe, actually has 400 gig interfaces on it. Okay, and so what we usually see when we're deploying these things is we're trying to keep port density high. So we'll tend, even in the case of 25 gig or 10 gig, we'll tend to deploy 100 gig or 40 gig respectively, and then split those ports. It's fairly trivial to do on every switch manufacturer I've run across, and you can take a 100 gig port, split it into 4 25s, so your port density stays high. And then we just run a single port channel to every node, and we usually like to have those split across switch chassis, so MLAG or VPC or whatever your switch vendor likes to call that, so that you can be resilient against a whole switch failure or any port or path failure. And this means, this for scalability purposes and for data protection purposes, these high bandwidths are very important. We need to be able to send a lot of data between nodes when we're rebuilding away from a failed drive, because we do this in parallel and we get every single CPU and all of the disks involved in those rebuilds. And then scalability actually becomes easy because every port gets you 4 more nodes if you're splitting from 100 to 25, for example.
So the last question here we've got, and then we'll let you guys sum it up there a little bit more about some of the future thinking you have on here, is ransomware is a big thing these days. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the basic defense, the basic line of defense against ransomware that we provide is immutable snapshots. So you can take a file system snapshot every so often. It's basically a pointer to an image of the file system at that point in time. And so it's basically free capacity-wise until you start to change or delete data. Now, when you get hit by ransomware, everything changes. Every single block is getting changed. And so what'll happen is the file system will start to fill up, but you're still going to have read-only access. Even if it fills that entire file system up with changes, you're still going to have read-only access to the state of the file system before the ransomware attack. Okay, we've had a couple of customers saved this way from a nasty ransomware attack. So another thing you can do, and I had one of my integrator partners working on this functionality, was the idea of watching entropy in the file system. And when it gets beyond a baseline, you start sending alerts. And that was an API integration that was kind of looking at file content and snapshot content. And understanding when that started to happen. So he was able to alert about a ransomware attack as it got started. So you have a couple of options with Cumulo, but the main line of defense is really going to be those immutable read-only snapshots.
Yeah, that's good. Sam, just a last question for you then. Where do you see the future when it comes to all this aspect of remote collaboration and workers and things like that, obviously people have been doing, freelancers have been doing stuff remote for a while now, but it's really got serious. So go ahead, Sam.
I think that this is going to be our future for a long time, and it's not so much about what's been going on in the world, but people have learned to work from home. People have seen the value of doing that. Companies have seen the value of doing that as well, and solutions like Cumulo, where we can have cloud presence on-prem as necessary, are going to be critical to the future growth and future solutions.
Yeah, sounds good. And what about you, Mike?
I'm kind of in the same boat. When lockdown started happening, it was funny. We'd actually been talking about this hybrid cloud editorial workflow for a while, calling it Cumulo Cloud Studio. And I mean, we were talking about this at NAB in 2019. And so we've been talking about it over and over again. And so when lockdown started, we started getting all these calls. Hey, that Cloud Studio thing you were talking about, can you help us help us get that set up. And so we actually saw a flurry of activity as people frantically move things into the public cloud or figured out how to deal with private cloud remote editorial artists. So I think that the same way Sam does, that I think this mode of working is here to stay. I think everybody has learned it's a good way to get to talent that might not want to make the commute, but they'll happily, connect to your editorial environment and get some work done for you. And so I think it's going to stick around. I think hybrid cloud is here to stay.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I don't think that's disappearing for sure. And I think we're still going to have this on-prem, off-prem discussion for quite a while. We'll see where that where that goes. Anyway, I think we've covered a lot of stuff today. I certainly appreciate all the comments from Sam on his experience with that. And Mike, you talk about the systems in general and where things are going to. And I think put a slide up here if anybody wants any more contact info. That's who to get a hold of. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, please do reach out to us. We're happy to talk about it, even if you don't have immediate plans. We'd like to talk to you about what we can do so that those tools are available to you when you start thinking about changes you want to make downstream. We're happy to connect you with cloud experts, and we can schedule a demo. We can show you demos of workflows or some of the analytics or visibility I mentioned. It's very interesting. It's very revealing to see that stuff and understand how much more visibility you could have into your studio. And you can even invite us over and we can do a workflow assessment. I mean, maybe we're not coming over, maybe we're just whiteboarding on a Zoom or something. But we're happy to talk to you about your existing workflow and do some thinking with you about how you might leverage public or private cloud for some of that workflow.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thanks again for the time today, and keep in touch.